Nobody expected a quiet church land issue to turn into a full courtroom storm. But that's exactly what happened, and the situation around Bishop Winans took a direction few people could have predicted. What started as a simple question about property boundaries has now become one of the most talked about disputes in the community, complete with court filings, unexpected revelations, and a growing spotlight that refuses to dim. The surprising part, this entire conflict didn't begin with anger. It began with confusion, the kind that slowly builds until one day there's no choice but to confront it. To understand why things escalated, we need to go back to the moment the tension first took root. At first, the issue looked routine, the sort of land disagreement most churches settle over a couple of conversations, but almost immediately, something felt different. The property connected to the church wasn't just empty space, it carried layers of history, old agreements, family ties, and spoken promises that some members believed were never honored. What looked simple on paper was far more emotional in reality, because the land meant something to people who had been around for decades. Rumors suggest discussions happened years ago, long before Bishop Winans ever stepped into leadership. Some say certain families were told one thing, others believed responsibilities were split differently. And slowly, as memories collided with expectations, a small misunderstanding grew into something much harder to control. Inside the church, members began sharing their own versions of the story. A few insisted everything was handled the right way. Others felt decisions were rushed. When memories, emotions, and paperwork don't line up, disagreements eventually rise to the surface. And that's exactly what happened here. The turning point arrived the moment someone asked the question no one wanted to address: who officially controls this land? Once that question was on the table, there was no going back. Both sides felt strongly, and the only path left was to let the court look at the documents, the time, and the decisions leading up to the dispute. But if anyone thought the court filing would bring clarity, they were mistaken. What happened next changed everything. As soon as the case entered the courtroom, the tone shifted. Conversations that once happened quietly inside church offices were now part of public records, and court documents have no interest in feelings, only dates, agreements, signatures, and hard facts. Those facts revealed details that shocked even members who believed they knew the land's history. Some agreements were older than people realized. Others were missing key signatures. Timelines that members remembered one way looked completely different in the filings. There were verbal understandings no one ever wrote down. Moments where decisions were made quickly, and records that didn't match the stories being shared in the congregation. This created instant division. Some members felt vindicated. Others felt blindsided. And many were simply confused, learning for the first time how complicated their own church land really was. But the biggest shift came when the court made a request, one that hinted something in the original documents wasn't completely clear. The judge asked for additional records. That single request changed the atmosphere inside the church. People sensed the story was about to expand, and not everyone was ready for what might surface next. When the additional documents were reviewed, small but meaningful details emerged. There were old land references from previous owners, mentions of shared use agreements no one remembered, notes about decisions made quickly during periods of transition, the sort of small details that make sense to leaders at the time, but cause huge confusion years later, when they resurfaced without context. Some members were stunned to learn that certain questions about the property existed long before Bishop Winans stepped into his role. What many thought was a new issue now appeared to be a long-standing concern that had been quietly passed from one leadership group to the next. That alone reshaped how many viewed the dispute. Then, community leaders who had participated in early discussions spoke up. Some believed the land was always meant for exclusive church use. Others remembered conversations suggesting shared control. And the more memories resurfaced, the more the story expanded into something layered, complex, and deeply emotional. This pushed the congregation into three groups. Those who immediately defended Bishop Winans, saying he inherited a mess. Those who wanted the court to sort everything out, even if the truth was uncomfortable. And those who simply felt lost in all the confusion. But the next twist didn't come from paperwork. It came from a statement, a question that changed the entire direction of the dispute. Someone connected to the wider faith community asked a simple, almost innocent question: who was responsible for reviewing the land agreements before the decisions were made? It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't dramatic, but it struck the room instantly, because the truth was simple. No one had ever explained that part, not the leaders, not the trustees, not even the individuals involved in early planning meetings. This question reopened an entire history many hoped would stay in the past. It shifted attention away from what happened and toward how it happened, who reviewed the documents, who approved the decisions, were steps missed, was anything misunderstood. As the discussion grew, members remembered old meetings, forgotten committees, and unfinished reports. Some recalled hearing land usage mentioned briefly but never explained. Others assumed everything was resolved years ago because, as they put it, no one told us otherwise. Suddenly, the conflict wasn't about the land. It was about communication, or the lack of it. Tension grew. Some believed leadership did everything correctly. Others believed miscommunication caused the entire mess. And for the first time, the spotlight widened beyond Bishop Winans. It shifted onto past leaders, old committees, and processes that might never have been fully completed. Then came another twist. Reports suggested that older members, former committee leaders, retired staff, even individuals who had connections to previous land decisions might be asked to share what they remembered, not to take sides, but to help the court understand what the original intent of the land truly was. This possibility shook the congregation. Once people from decades earlier are brought in, the story rarely remains simple. It becomes personal, emotional, and layered with history people forgot they were part of. But just as the congregation was adjusting to this new reality, the situation expanded far beyond the church. Questions began circulating online. Community members, former residents, and supporters started asking what was going on. Small local outlets took notice. They weren't reporting scandal, just trying to understand why a respected bishop and a historic church were suddenly involved in a legal battle. This public curiosity added pressure. People wanted updates, clarity, reassurance, and that's when the court made another request. More clarifications, more documents, more details. Not because the church was at fault, but because the story had become more complex the deeper investigators went. Once again, the case grew instead of shrinking. Around this time, reports surfaced about the land itself, that the property included older survey lines, previous ownership layers, possible easements, and structures that hadn't been discussed publicly for years. Suddenly, the issue wasn't only administrative, it was physical. The actual land was more intricate than people believed. The congregation felt the weight of this discovery. If the land held more history than anyone realized, what else might surface next? And then came the biggest shift of all, a development that placed Bishop Winans directly in the center of the unfolding drama. The judge requested a formal explanation from him, not as punishment, but because the court needed clarity only he could provide. They wanted to understand who oversaw which decisions, how certain approvals were made, and what the leadership believed the land's purpose to be. The reaction was instant. Supporters defended him fiercely. Others hoped this would finally bring answers. Community members watched closely, understanding the significance of the moment. As preparations were being made, another unexpected wave of information arrived from people who had been involved in church leadership long before the current dispute. They came forward with old notes, meeting summaries, and memories they believed could help the court understand what the land was meant for from the beginning. Their intention wasn't political, it was to help, but their involvement reminded everyone of something important. This dispute wasn't new, it was old, layered, inherited, and now finally reaching its breaking point. And as all this information was being prepared to submit, the case entered its most intense chapter yet, a phase filled with speculation, heightened emotions, and an outcome no one could confidently predict. Because now, it wasn't just a land dispute, it was a test of leadership, history, community, trust, and the future of an entire congregation. And the final decision, whatever it turns out to be, will shape the church in ways no one saw coming.